Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. We've had a few requests for horses, and I'd like to paint 5 different breeds for this unit of Ellyrian Reavers. We also have some recipe cards for this video, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the models, I undercoated them with white primer, and I attached them to corks for easier handling. Let's paint a buckskin horse, starting with a layer of skeleton horde all over. When using contrast paints, work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. I'm not too worried if some of this paint gets in the other areas, since I'll be base coating most of those with opaque paint later. But I do want to be careful around any cloth that will be white, since any mistakes will take time to fix. The base coat looks a little uneven, and I'd like to deepen the color as well, so I painted a second layer on the model. I'm not going to paint a second layer on the mane and tail though, one layer is enough for those areas. Now I'd like to add some darker color to the nose and the bottom of the legs, and for that I'm using Ratling Grime. Contrast paint is really easy to blend. Just apply some paint to a small section, rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend out the edge. I also painted the mane and tail with Ratling Grime. I'd like the mane and tail to be a little darker, so I painted one more layer of Ratling Grime. At this stage you could call the horse finished and paint the rest of the model, but I'd like to add some highlights. I began with some thin glazes of Zandri dust and built up a few layers to even out the skin. If your skeleton horde layers dried on the lighter side, Zandri dust might be too dark for this step, and you may need to lighten up the Zandri dust with some Bonewhite. I focused the glazes on the lighter portions of the body, and avoided painting the legs where they start getting darker. I mixed a very small amount of black paint into the Zandri dust, and added some glazes about midway down the legs to smooth out any of the blends. This mix is a little gray, and if you want to make it warmer, you could mix some Rhinox hide in instead of black. Next I mixed some Bonewhite into the Zandri dust and highlighted the lighter sections of the body. I thinned the paint with water and added some glazes to the larger, smooth sections, and I used less diluted paint for an edge highlight on the sharper details. I added one more highlight with pure Bonewhite, and I restricted it to the sharpest edges and corners. I didn't paint this one as a glaze, but you could if you prefer a more blended look. Then I highlighted the mane, tail, and bottom of the legs with Steel Legion Drab. For the Chestnut horse, I began by mixing about 4 parts Gore-Grunta fur and 1 part Steel Legion Drab. The Steel Legion Drab paint is opaque, and mixing a small amount of this into a contrast paint will help the base coat dry with a smoother and more even finish. Even with the addition of opaque paint, the base coat still looks a little splotchy, and it's easy to even it out a bit with a glaze. Using the same mix as before, I diluted it with an equal amount of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I painted anywhere the base coat looked uneven. Next I painted the mane and tail with Skeleton Horde. After the first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. Next I added a little Ratling grime to the end of his nose, and I blended out the edge of the paint. Just apply some paint, rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to blend out the edge. I'd like to add some light markings to the bottom of the legs, and I painted that with Bonewhite. You could blend the edge if you want, but I'm just going to leave a jagged kind of line. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. Then I shaded the markings with a layer of Skeleton Horde. Next, I painted the hooves with Steel Legion Drab. And then I shaded them with my armor wash mix, which is an equal parts mix of Ratling grime, contrast medium, and Lahmian medium. At this stage you could call the horse finished and paint the rest of the model, but I'd like to add some highlights. First I'll work on the brown areas, and Mournfang brown is a really close match to the existing color. Thin down the paint with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, add some glazes wherever the surface looks uneven. The paint should dry quickly, and it shouldn't run or flow anywhere. If the paint runs into the cracks, it means your brush is overloaded. Next, I mixed a small amount of Bonewhite into the Mournfang brown, and I highlighted some of the edges. You could blend this with glazes if you prefer a more natural look, or you could paint stylized edge highlights. I like to use a mix of both, and I'll paint softer glazes on the larger, flat areas, and I'll paint sharp edge highlights on the areas where the model is sculpted with sharp features. I'd like to add one more highlight, so I mixed some more Bonewhite into the Mournfang brown. The exact ratio will vary from painter to painter. It depends on how big of a jump you'd like to make between colors. Rather than glazing this highlight, I painted it as a sharp edge highlight. I like the stylized, graphic quality of the edge highlights, but you could glaze it instead if you want to. Next I highlighted the markings, mane, and tail with Bonewhite. I thinned the paint with water and built up several thin glaze layers on the bottom of the legs. Then I used less diluted paint to pick out the edges of the hair. I highlighted the hooves next with lines of Zandri dust. I began the gray horse with an equal parts mix of Nuln oil and Administratum gray. This mix will function just like a contrast paint, only it's a little thicker. If you want it to flow more, you can add some more Nuln oil to the mix, or add a very small amount of water. Work on one section at a time, and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then, use the brush to soak up any excess paint. I like to run the brush a couple times over the larger, smooth sections, and basically move the paint around until it looks as smooth and as even as possible. It'll never be perfect, but the more even I can make it now, the less touch-up work I'll have to do later. Next I shaded the legs and nose with Nuln oil. You could add more or less shading if you want, and I think it would be a good idea to vary the shade and markings between models. I added one more layer of Nuln oil, a little closer to the bottom of the legs, and this should result in a blended effect, with the color getting darker as it goes down. You could paint a couple more layers if you want it darker, but I think I'll stop with 2. I'd like to add a dappled kind of effect to the hide, and it's really easy to do with more Nuln oil and a stippling kind of brush mark. Using an older number 2 brush, grab a very small amount of paint, and use a tapping motion wherever you want to add the dappling. Nuln oil is fairly transparent, so the first layer will be very subtle. You can build up a couple layers if you want a stronger effect. Next I painted the mane, tail, and hooves with Ratling grime. Then I highlighted the hooves with storm vermin fur. For highlighting the coat, I used Administratum gray and white. The exact shade you need will vary depending on how light or dark your model is. I ended up using Administratum gray on the bottom of the legs, and for the lighter sections, I used an equal parts mix of gray and white. I also used the light gray mix to add some stippling to the hide, just a few small marks here and there. Let's paint a really light cream colored horse. For this one you want to make sure that you have a very bright white primer. I diluted some skeleton horde with contrast medium, about 2 parts medium to 1 part skeleton horde, and I painted over the whole horse. Work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint. On the larger, smooth sections, I like to go back with the brush and move around the paint until it looks as smooth as possible. The more even I can make it now, the less touch-up work I'll have to do later. I'd like to add a peach tone to the end of the nose, and I diluted some Bugman's Glow paint with a fair amount of water. With barely any paint on the brush, I added a thin layer to the end of the nose. You could paint a second layer if you want to deepen the color, but I think one is enough for me. Next I put some full-strength skeleton horde on my palette. I'd like to darken the legs and add a blended effect. Just paint one section at a time, then rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to soften the edge. I don't want the coat to get too dark, so I'm making sure to soak up any excess paint. I repeated the blending process on the rest of the legs, and then I painted a layer of skeleton horde on the mane and tail. Next I shaded the eyes and nostrils with Targor Rageshade. Then I shaded the hooves with my armor wash mix. This is an equal parts mix of Ratling Grime, Contrast Medium, and Lahmian Medium. I used this paint just because I had it on hand, and you could use any other dark color instead, such as Nuln Oil. Now for some highlights. I began by highlighting the bottom portions of the legs and the mane and tail with Bonewhite. I thinned down the paint with water and applied a soft glaze on a few areas above the hooves. Then I used some undiluted paint and picked out the sharpest edges. For the lighter parts of the horse's coat, I mixed Bonewhite and Offwhite. The exact shade you need may vary from mine. There are a lot of different variables, from how light your primer was, how much you diluted the base coat, and how heavy you applied the base coat. In the end, you'll want to mix a shade that's as close as you can get to the overall color. Then dilute it with water and apply it as a glaze to smooth out any uneven areas. For the bay horse, I began by base coating the model with an equal parts mix of Dryad bark and Gore-Grunta fur. The dark brown contrast paints are very transparent, and they tend to look uneven over such a light primer. By mixing in an opaque paint like Dryad bark, it makes the paint dry a lot more evenly. It's a lot thicker than a regular contrast paint though, and you can add a small amount of water if you want it to flow better. Don't add too much water, otherwise it won't dry dark enough. I'd like to add a darker blended effect on the legs, and I painted that with my armor wash mix. This is an equal parts mix of Ratling Grime, Contrast Medium, and Lahmian Medium. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Nuln Oil instead, but it may take an extra layer or two since it isn't as strong. I painted one section at a time, rinsed the brush, wiped it on a paper towel, and then used the clean brush to blend the edge. I also painted a layer of the armor wash mix on the mane and tail. I'd like those areas to be a little darker, so I added one more layer of my armor wash mix. Now for some highlights. First I highlighted the main body with Mournfang brown. I thinned the paint with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I painted some glazes on the raised areas. I built up several layers, one on top of the other, working progressively towards the edges. The result is a blended kind of effect. If you make any mistakes or need to touch up with a darker brown, I would recommend mixing some Rhinox hide into the Mournfang brown. I gradually faded the highlights out about halfway down the legs. Next I added an edge highlight to the brown coat with XV88. You could apply this paint in glazes as well if you want a blended effect. I prefer the sharp edge highlights, so I won't blend this stage. Then I highlighted the mane, tail, and bottom of the legs with Steel Legion Drab. This is a fairly big jump up in value, and I find that the larger the jump in value, the more precise the highlights need to be. You may find it easier to mix a mid-tone, and in that case, I would recommend mixing in a small amount of Rhinox hide. After painting each horse's coat, I painted the teeth with Bonewhite, leaving a thin, dark outline. Then I painted the eyes with black. You don't normally see the whites of a horse's eyes unless they're spooked, so I like to add a really small dot of white in the back corner, like a reflection, and nothing more than that. Before I paint the rest of the models, I thinned down some black and painted a narrow outline where any unpainted areas meet up against the horse. This is a technique known as blacklining, and it will add extra definition to the model. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and now on Patreon as well. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. I don't normally paint a lot of horses, and when I do, they tend to be for armies, so I usually paint them all the same color just to make things easier. In the end, I think the regiment looks much better with a variety, rather than having all the horses the same. What do you think? Do you like all the horses to be different? Did I leave out your favorite breed? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.